One. Hello, Mr. Jack. How are you doing tonight? Welcome to Daydreams with Dylan on this fine Tuesday
I'm
evening.
very well, Mr. Dylan, and I guess I am night dreaming, right?
Right. We couldn't figure out the time zone difference. We were
Yeah.
like, when the podcast first started, we were actually streaming during the day. So Daydreams made a lot more sense. And it kind of went with the whole thematic aura of the podcast, but now it's it's at night.
Well, podcasts are big in India, and it's daytime in India. So there you go.
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. It's daytime somewhere.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Jack, how are you doing tonight? You doing all right? How did you come to be?
How do they come to be? How did they come to exist?
Well, yeah, I know that was an awkward way of putting things. How did you end up where you are today? Have you written? So I see the background is counter-feminist.
Yep. The counter-feminist social worker.
So how do we get here? Let's hop right in.
So you might ask, what is a counter-feminist?
Okay.
You want to ask that? That is a common question, and actually it's sort of the idea of using the phrase, what is a counter-feminist? And what is the difference between a counter-feminist and an anti-feminist?
Right, because most people are going to hear that and they're going to immediately just jump to conclusions.
Well, yeah, and shame on them. There's too many conclusions jumped to about the point of view that men have about what's going on between the sexes. An anti-feminist listens to women talk about their issues as women and girls and doesn't want to hear it and says, oh my God, that's a bunch of baloney. Feminism is a bunch of baloney. It's the worst thing ever. Women are on a pedestal. I don't believe a word of it. That's an anti-feminist.
Okay.
A counter-feminist, on the other hand, listens to women talk about their gender issues, the problems that they endure by virtue of their sex, and says, yes, and let's also talk about the gender issues of men and boys, because the most sexist idea of all is the belief that only one sex is ever sexist and only one sex is ever harmed by that other sex's sexism. The most sexist idea of all to think that only men are sexist and women never are.
So why the idea of counter-feminism? Like, let's start from the beginning then. What is feminism?
There are millions of definitions of feminism.
Okay.
You get 12 people together and you get 13 different definitions. One of the dictionary definitions of feminism is a person who believes in and advocates for equal rights between the sexes. Now, if that is the definition that you and I will have tonight, I'm a feminist. But since there really is no central board anywhere that certifies what the definition of feminism is, it's fair to point out that in practice, in the real world, feminism has come to mean the advocacy of equal rights for women and girls. Now, equal to what? Well, they don't say equal to men. The idea that women have fewer rights than men is correct in some ways, in some realms of life. In other realms of life.
What do you mean by that? So where would
So in other realms of life, men have fewer rights and privileges and opportunities than women. Here's what I mean by that. If you think about the male domain, what women wanted equal access to, and I'm glad they wanted equal access to it. It's good. It's healthy for everybody that women should not be confined on the basis of sexist stereotypes. The domain that women wanted access to was the domain of business, academia, government, careers, making money. those kinds of things, all of which are valuable and good. And women have benefited by gaining access to them. You can think of the male domain as a hierarchy. It's often called the patriarchy. And the way I envision the patriarchy is as a hierarchy with sort of like a pyramid, sort of like a triangle, with a few men at the very top of the pyramid. You know, the president, the members of Congress, the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies, and you can work your way down. A lot of power at the top. And it's natural that when we stand in front of a huge structure, our eyes go up to the top and like, wow, look how big that is. Oh, and it's all men up there, mostly men up there. And we do not naturally tend to look down at all of the men who have very, very, very little power. Far more many men have very little power than there are men who have a lot of power. We need to remember that. We need to talk about that, because when we say that men have all the power, that's a sexist statement. Some men have all the power. Most men have very little. Some have absolutely none. And so you can think of the male power structure, if you want, as an office building, 80 stories tall, with the executives at the top. Now, when you think about women's domain, women have done a good job, or the feminist machinery, the feminist idea machinery, spin control, spin machinery, has tried to convince us all that women have no power. The word oppression is often used. Men oppress women. And so the idea that they want us to accept is that men have all the power, women have none. That is where my counter-feminism comes into play and says, no, it's not true that women have no power. Whereas the male power structure is a skyscraper, 80 stories tall. The female power structure is more like a convention center. It's only 2 or 3 stories tall, but it covers 18 acres. And the idea that not much of importance goes on in convention centers is just not right. A lot of very important little things go on in that convention center. And that's the female power structure. And just as men were not crazy about having women into the male power structure, there are many women who are not interested in having men in the female power structure. Now, let's get a little more nuanced here. Women who have achieved great success and happiness in the formerly male domain, that is, women who have really good careers and have jobs that they really like and need to spend a lot of time at those jobs, they're very happy to have men participate fully in the female domain of the family, parenting, relationships, and social life. However, there are many, 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 many women who do not have fabulous careers, who, if they have jobs, often have jobs that are really just drudgery. And so their primary source of happiness is not by being at the top of a huge domain, a huge hierarchy, but by being at the top of a small one. And millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of women know that in the female power structure, they are supported in being at the top of their little hierarchy, which is namely the family. Women are much more the queens of families than men are the kings of corporate America. And so women aren't struggling to maintain huge amounts of power. They're just happy maintaining small amounts of power, because the small amounts of power they get are really, really powerful and rich and beautiful and warm and life affirming and lovely. To be in a position where you get to have primary relationship with your own children. You don't have a boss leaning over you telling you how to run the house. And if your husband tries to tell you how to run the house, you know exactly how to tell him where to get off.
Real quick, I have a couple questions. I understand the hierarchy of power in terms of looking at where people are and looking at the very few that have made it, and then kind of extrapolating that to all groups of people. I think it might be a little stretch to say, though, that the female, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the female dominated form of power is, or the convention center that you mentioned, is more or less at the hierarchy of a family structure. Is that, did I get that right?
The convention center houses the female power structure, and the female power structure is lateral, not stacked on top of each other. It's not, there isn't a huge gradation in the amount of power between women as there is between men. And so the female power structure is an interlocking network of women at the tops of their families who support each other. They don't need to compete each other, because a woman's queenness of her family is not dependent on the woman next door not being a queen. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Women being supported as the primary people in their families is supported by other women being the primary people in their families.
But
the protections, the laws, the customs.
Right? That was the traditional view, correct?
It was the traditional view, and unfortunately, it remains for many people the traditional view. You still hear women, many women, who don't have great careers, whose primary function, primary source of happiness in the world, you still hear those women saying this: I'm the mother. I'm the mother, sort of asserting her supremacy in the family. I'm the mother. That's not really healthy when you want to have men in your communities feeling valued, when you want them to feel that their ideas about how to raise children and how to have a community are important. You know, it was a big waste 60 years ago. It was a big waste when we did not allow women to exercise their talents as business people, as government leaders, as scientists. It was a big waste because women had a lot of talent that was prohibited because they were women. Today, we still are guilty of a big waste of men's capacities in the family to be important and valuable in the family. There are many of these little queendoms that really don't have much, if any, male influence. Right. And the idea that a man wants to be equal to her in that little kingdom can be very upsetting to a lot of women. No, I'm the mother.
So just for clarification here, we're not saying that women fit into political position, or not political. I'm sorry. I'm reading a comment right now that I'm about to ask that involves political leaders. But what we're not saying is women who have had these traditional roles in society should stay in these traditional gender roles, correct? We're not saying that, correct?
Not saying that at all. That's part of the problem, that women have options far more than men do. Women have far many options than men do. Girls growing up see many more options for themselves than boys do. You know what the suicide statistics are?
Yes.
For boys and girls?
Substantially higher.
like 3 times as high.
The issue when I hear people bring up statistics about suicide rates amongst boys and girls is there's one common variable or factor that's neglected when we talk about the rate of higher suicide for males, and it's the fact that males commit suicide, or let me rephrase that. Males are more successful at suicide. That's where the numbers are different. That's where males have a higher rate. But if you look at the attempts of suicide, males and females actually attempt suicide at pretty much predominantly the same rate, which is really interesting.
No, actually, girls will attempt it at higher rates than boys.
Right. But they're less successful because
yes,
males typically use more lethal versions like guns, jumping off bridges, other things like that.
That's often said. That's often said. I don't think that there's good science behind that. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with the president of the American Association of Suicidology. I told him about a day when I was working on an ambulance in Southern California. We had back-to-back calls for suicide attempts. The first call we got to an apartment where there was a woman on the phone crying to her girlfriend. She had taken 12 aspirin. Her girlfriend called the ambulance. We had to take her to the hospital. She is a statistic as a suicide attempt. The research needs to be much more clear about what was the intent. Was it to die, or was it to get help or to seek attention? The next call we got on our ambulance was for a suicide. We went into an apartment. It was dark. We didn't find anybody. Went into the bedroom, turned on the lights, and saw a man sprawled backwards over his bed. When I put my finger on his carotid to see if he had a pulse, blood came gushing out of his mouth. I mentioned this pair of suicide attempts to the president of the American Association of Suicidology. He said, it's very typical, very typical. Now, we need better research. From my point of view, I want better research because it bothers me when people see boys committing suicide at 3 times the rate of girls and saying, oh, it's just because they have more access to guns. We don't know that. Girls have access to pills, they have access to razor blades, they have access to carbon monoxide, they have access to rat poison, they have access to bridges that they can throw themselves off of. I'm not satisfied. And actually, I'm kind of dissatisfied and displeased with people who want to explain away the situation for boys. It's just, well, you know, they have better access to guns. Girls can get access to guns too.
Right. And it's not as simple as just saying that. And no one wants to downplay, but to simply say that.
I think a lot of people do want to downplay it, Dylan. That's part of the problem.
Right. And that's sad, obviously. And I am in total agreement with you that, you know, we should be focusing on boys and girls equally. It's just when I hear things like boys commit suicide at a higher rate, it sort of neglects the feminine qualities. It's like, well, it's not that these two genders are going through things differently. It's that, again, and I don't mean to use this language, it's males typically use more lethal versions. That's why the suicide rate typically for males, at least successful suicide rates, is higher. And I'm not saying that to downplay males. I'm saying that to highlight that that's still that process there is present in females as well. I'm not saying that to downplay the males.
So the question needs to be, if women are really intent on killing themselves, why are they using such non-lethal methods?
Well, I don't think that's.
We need research on this, Dylan. We need research on this.
Why is that important?
Why is it important to have research so that we know?
No, I'm asking. Well, why is that question? Why are girls not using more lethal weapons? Why is that important?
Why is that important? Because we need to know whether they are really attempting to kill themselves, as boys are, or are they seeking help, as boys do not feel worthy of doing.
Is an attempt at suicide not an indication of help, though?
An attempt at suicide by a girl eating 12 aspirin?
I don't know if I'm understanding here. I don't know if I'm understanding this. Maybe if you could,
probably aren't.
Maybe if you could re-elaborate it for me. I'm
not sure what you're not. I'm not sure what you're not clear on.
I'm not clear on why it's not as important to focus on the suicide rates for women and just to call it that it's just an attention-seeking behavior. Because fundamentally, what I hear, that's what I hear.
Here's the answer. Because they might, and this is where the research can help us, they might not actually be suicide attempts. They might be attempts to get help and sympathy. And then the question also is, why do boys not feel as able and worthy of seeking help and sympathy? Why do they go right to guns and suicide? Important questions, Dylan. Very important questions.
So let me ask this then. If a guy tries to commit suicide by jumping off a bridge and is unsuccessful, is that an attempt at suicide that's looking for someone to get help? Or is that an attention-seeking behavior if he's unsuccessful at it? Or do we count that as an attempted suicide?
That's where we need research. You will define your terms. You will define what counts as a suicide attempt, what counts as what are the indicators of a real suicide attempt? What are the indicators of seeking attention? And you let the scientists work it out. That's what research is. And we don't have valid research. I can tell you this. I'm a social worker, and I can tell you that the NASW, National Association of Social Workers, accepted a large grant to research suicide in girls and to try to prevent suicide in girls. They did nothing about suicide in boys.
And that's a problem. I agree with that.
That is a problem.
I 100% agree with that. There definitely is more of a need or a savior complex when it comes to females than it is to save a male. And this is prevalent on social media, as we know with the Gabby Petito case, that, you know, there's this white female savior complex where if a white girl goes missing, then, you know, the whole world gathers behind them. And it's non-existent for males. And I agree with you. I'm not saying I don't agree with you in terms of the male awareness for suicide rates and the male awareness for these power dynamics is neglected and it's seldomly talked about. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm trying to say is sometimes when we talk about these things in the framework of gender specifically, it almost as though it downplays the other one. And that's what I want to be careful to not do. I don't want to downplay one gender's needs or the reasons for why they do these things and elicit these behaviors in favor of another. Like that, I think we're going in the wrong direction if we do that. If we try to elevate one's problems and then neglect the other one, and then vice versa, what we end up is the same equation just in reverse. Does that make sense?
So we don't want to downplay anything.
Right.
We don't want to upplay anything.
Exactly.
We need to know what the situation is.
I agree with you.
And I'm saying we need to research that.
Okay. So we have a couple people that joining in chat. Pink Duct Tape saying, so a boy is more likely to feel the need to be successful with taking themselves out of the equation, and that women tend to have a hesitancy. Is that what you're saying, Pink Duct Tape? We have Chandler joining in. Hey, Chandler, how you doing? Dell, my mom in here. Amon, how you doing, buddy? Got a couple people in here. So do you believe men are more likely to be ignored for their mental health rather than females? I'd agree with that.
Think about it. Think about it. Are men valued for their feelings? Not as much as women are. Tell me how you feel. Talk to me. But geez, if you tell me that you're afraid or you're weak or you're vulnerable, that might be hard for me to take because, I'm looking for a strong man. Now, who am I talking about here? Who am I imitating? Not every woman, but it is very strong in our culture that men are supposed to be strong. This really goes back pretty far. Do you know who sang, as far as I know, about this the first? It was Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan wrote the song, "It Ain't Me, Babe. You say you're looking for someone to be strong. We'll always stand by you, always take care of you, would die for you. It ain't me, babe." It's very deep in our culture. And it makes sense that it's deep in our culture because, back when we were a little band of hominids walking across the grasslands of Africa, if we didn't take care of the babies, we were going to be extinct, right? So who had the breasts? Who could feed the baby most easily and conveniently? The mother could. So what was the best role for the father, for the man? To be out on the periphery of that campground, or to be out in the lead as the little band of people walked across the grasslands, to be out there, to be on the advance, and to sacrifice yourself if you need to so that the children and the mothers could get away. It's very deep in us. But these primitive structures, these primitive requirements that we grew up with, that we became a species with, they became less and less important as civilization became more and more sophisticated, strong, and solid.
Right.
But we still operate on those old principles. Look, if 60 years ago, a woman who wanted to be a lawyer was looked at askance. What? You don't want to fulfill your natural role as a mother?
Right.
And now we have a situation where men who are saying, I don't want to be out there competing and trying to climb to the top of the skyscraper. I don't want that kind of life. I want what women want. I want work-life balance. Women want equality in the formerly male power structure. Men want equality in the formerly female power structure. We want to be valued and respected as equal partners in the business of raising kids, building families, building communities.
I actually agree with all that. I think that you're exactly on the money with that. I think the different, whatever you want to call it, power struggles, the different energies or masculine and feminine qualities, gender roles, whatever you want to call it, I definitely think it's evolving to where it's more fluid, where people want to adopt naturally the opposite role. Like, for example, like you were just saying, men want to stay at home, and it's becoming more genuinely acceptable. And I actually agree with all those things. I don't think that there's I think that that's evolving. It's really interesting to see how it's going to be played out.
Yeah. Now, I'm a social worker. I'm a retired social worker.
Right.
And so I'm interested in social problems. And when you think about the communities that have the most social problems, you will see a fair degree of women who do not have fabulous careers, where they are not interested in having men as equal partners in their little queendoms, and who are, in fact, sometimes interested in getting him gone completely. Maybe asking him to babysit once in a while, that kind of thing. Maybe, being okay with if he takes the kids to the park to play ball. But an equal parent, no, not so much. And we are wasting the talents that men have for knowing having some ideas, some perspective on how to raise kids, what might be good to do in this situation. I used to be a parole and probation agent in central Baltimore. And a lot of the men I had to work with because they were on supervision, they were out of jail on the basis of staying out of trouble. These men, almost all of them, grew up with very poor fathering on their father's parts, and they do not want to do to their kids what their fathers did to them. They want to provide the love that a father can provide. And these guys can't catch a break because in America, to be a man and not to be a loser, what's heavily involved in that is making some money. A man without money in America is in a very different social situation than a woman without money. And this is especially true in our most troubled neighborhoods, in our lower and marginalized strata of society. I had guys in my office crying because they could not catch a break. I live in Baltimore. I grew up in Baltimore, up and down the East Coast. And I spoke to a fellow in Dallas the other day who told me this is true. I have a very deep spot in my heart for the problems of African-American men because they get it because they're Black, and they get it because they're male. You're inferior because you're Black, you're inferior because you're male. Yes, there are ideas about how women are inferior too, but we've worked 60 years on getting over that. We haven't really done much to convince the rest of our society, certainly not our leaders, that there are stereotypes, negative stereotypes at work about men that cause us to institute really bad social policies that waste the desires and the talents of men to be the kind of people we say we want them to be. Up and down the East Coast and in other cities across the country, whenever I ask a Black man, if I get a chance to talk with him and get a chance to talk about how he grew up and what his life was like, I say, did you ever hear Black men ain't shit? And unless they say, well, no, I didn't hear that myself, but I know a lot of men who did, they always say, heard it all the time, heard it all the time. Now, this isn't because they're Black that they ain't shit, because they're hearing it from other Blacks. It's because they're men and they don't make a lot of money. Now, why don't they make a lot of money? Well, there's lots of reasons they don't make a lot of money. Many reasons we don't make a lot of money, but they're fixable. The war on poverty was essentially a war on fathers. And if it wasn't a war on fathers, fathers were certainly collateral damage. We need to fix that. We need to correct that. And as long as we talk and insist that the only gender issues worth talking about are women's, we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there. We need to take account of the fact that there are lots of ugly stereotypes, nasty stereotypes about men and boys. Go ahead.
So what it seems like is, though, that we're challenging and I hear and appreciate what you're saying in terms of specifically raising awareness for social issues that involve males, and we seldomly talk about those things. And it seems like these social issues are less institutionalized rather than more socialized. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's maybe fair to say, when you say that they're more socialized and less institutionalized, I wonder if you're suggesting that they are, because they're not institutionalized and they're not systemic in institutions, that they are somehow less egregious. If that's where you're going,
that's not what I'm saying.
Where you, okay, well, good.
So what I'm saying is that typically, so the argument for feminism is, at least from my understanding, again, I this should be a TED Talk. It's interesting, right? So from my understanding, a lot of the issues with that feminists bring up is that there's not as much institutionalized power for females. It's not as though that, again, when you talked about the hierarchy earlier, they're sitting here looking at the very top of it and saying, see, it's dominated by men. And this is the hierarchy, the institutionalized power that I'm trying to fight. This is the one I'm trying to gain access to. And that's part of the argument for feminism, correct? Well, it sounds like, again, males that have traditionally dominated this institutionalized world, we're opting for other social realms, and we're talking about things like being more attentive in the family. And if you want to be more attentive in the family but don't make us enough money, well, then in the words like you were saying earlier, you ain't shit, right? Is that fair to say that we're trying to?
I would suggest that the convention center, the conference center, is also an institution. As a matter of fact, it might be an institution of institutions, sort of like the internet is a network of networks. Mm-hmm. It's very intertwined, interconnected. It's very powerful. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the two structures. You look at the male hierarchy, the male power structure. Yeah, you got the president, and you got the Congress people, and you got the Fortune 500 CEOs, and you work your way down, and it's mostly men at the top. But the hierarchy houses a patriarchy. The patriarchy, however, the purpose of the patriarchy is not to protect men. The purpose of the patriarchy back in the day, go back to when it was the men who decided on the grasslands of Africa whether we were going to try to go from this water hole to that watering hole, because I'm the one who's going to die if it's not a good idea. So, but the purpose is to, what do we do to keep the women and children alive and happy? How do we find water? It wasn't, how do we make men happy? It was, how do we survive? President Biden established a White House Council. It's up and running right now, Dylan. A White House Council on Gender Policy. They just issued their strategy report.
Is that good or bad?
It's a good idea. It's a terrible execution.
Okay, why is it a good idea? Why is it a terrible execution? Let's talk about that.
It's a good idea to have concern over gender issues, because gender issues permeate every aspect of society. It's a good idea to have concern about gender issues at the top of our federal government. It's a bad execution because they're only looking at the gender issues of one gender. They specifically say that that's their focus. Now, I need to clarify that. It's not that binary, because today, and in the White House Gender Policy Council, there is an awareness of the fact that sex and gender are not binary. There are many flavors of male and female and trans. And what's fair to say, though, is that the one flavor that gets virtually no attention is cisgendered heterosexuals. That's not right. That's not good, but that's the way it is. And It's got to stop. Now, this is a president, a male president. He's not, he is there to take care of women and children. He's not there to take care of other men. On the other hand, in the convention center, the sisterhood is powerful. And it's not about taking care of men. It's about taking care of men insofar as women need men to help take care of children. But it's not about making sure that men are treated fairly. It's about the sisterhood. It's about making sure that the female power structure stays intact.
So when we talk about men treated fairly, and again, I'm not trying to contradict anything you're saying, but it's fair to talk about the elephant in the room. And when we talk about men being treated fairly, what is the justification, or maybe not justification? What is the argument for or against the fact that these traditionally male-dominated powers of hierarchy or institutionalized power typically perpetrate some sort of, let's say, predatory behavior? For example, Harvey Weinstein. This is like probably the best example of this.
Or the worst example.
Or yes, or the worst example. Where acts like that typically in an all male environment get away. So what is, and I know Harvey Weinstein didn't get away, but
so what's fair for Harvey Weinstein is that he pay a heavy price.
Right.
What's fair for Jeffrey Epstein is that he pay a heavy price.
So a lot of the argument
But
comes from,
Dylan, please look, you're talking about how many men there. You're not looking at the millions and millions of men who are not only not in the C-suites on the 80th floor of the hierarchy, they're not even at ground level. They're in the basement shoveling coal.
And again, I'm not saying anything.
Now, what's fair for them? What's fair for them?
Well, let's clarify something here then. Because there is a trend going around right now called Kill All Men. Obviously, it's an egregious trend, but the point of it is to highlight the fact that so many women feel uncomfortable around men in power. And this isn't the people that are at the top of the hierarchy, it's just people that maybe have power over them or in their general vicinity. And the argument is, though, there is, again, the hashtag #MeToo movement was so big a couple of years ago and it's still kind of predominant today. And it's the accusation that men hold positions of power, or that there is a predominantly majority amount, or maybe it's not majority, maybe it's a minority, amount of women that feel as though that men perpetrate this kind of awareness enough that it makes women feel uncomfortable. And again, I'm just trying to talk about the elephant in the room. I'm not trying to accuse anything. Just want to figure out what your point of view is on that.
Well, there is a male power structure.
Right.
No doubt about it. Most men are at the bottom of it. It's important for men to take accountability for the male power structure. As human beings, we will sometimes be selfish. We will sometimes be unreasonable. We will sometimes be cruel, greedy. No doubt about it. Guess who else is human? Women. They will sometimes be selfish, sometimes be greedy, sometimes be cruel. And what I'm suggesting to you is that while there is a great gradation from extremely powerful to very powerless among men, there is much more homogeneity among women. And just about every woman, if she wanted to, could make it either impossible or very, very difficult, expensive, heartbreaking, depressing, dispiriting. She could make it possible for that man never to see his kids again.
And that's
power.
That's
power.
That's egregious, and that's terrible. And
yes,
actually, Pink Update says, I hate it because I hate it so wrong. I hate it. It's so wrong because not all men. And I agree. It's not all men. And I actually agree with a lot of your points when we're talking about men specifically. I think that the awareness for those things, I think, is seldomly talked about in the framework of, or in the presence of, women's issues. Totally agree. I just kind of wish you'd change your name. I think it frames it in the wrong way. I like the issues you talk about. I think that,
you know what, Dylan?
I really do.
The term
it frames it in a different way, right?
Yes, the term counter-feminist social worker gets me a lot of traction.
I bet it does.
Because my God, there's actually a person who's going to get on podcasts, and he's going to live stream, and he's going to say he doesn't agree with everything that the feminists are saying. Oh my God, that's so crazy. We have to see this. We have to find out what's wrong with this guy. Or what's he saying?
You've definitely found
look,
what's it called?
The idea of counter-feminism is not anti-feminism.
Right. I'm glad you made that clarification.
But just the idea that men have another point of view is the idea that that's so shocking is shocking. Look, in the early 60s, when the women's movement got started, you know the name Betty Friedan?
No, I don't.
Okay, Betty Friedan is pretty much credited with starting the modern feminist movement. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she talked about how, there was a lot to like about the traditional female role of staying home, being the housewife, taking care of the kids. There was a lot of good stuff there, but too much of any good thing is not a good thing. And there were lots of women who were just going crazy at home, not having any adult conversation, drinking 3 martinis in the afternoon, popping pills. They had been to college. They had brains on their shoulders. They wanted to do things. She called it the problem that has no name. At the same time she was talking about women's problems, she was also very sympathetic. People don't know this, but it's in the book. I've read it. She was also very sympathetic about the problems that husbands were facing, very much interrelated with the problems women were facing. So Betty Friedan was sympathetic. She was not interested in war. But in New York City, shortly after, or right around the time Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique came out, there was a group of radical women named the Red Stockings who issued the Red Stockings Manifesto. And rather than having any nuance, rather than talking about, there's difficulties of being a woman and there's also difficulties of being a man, and let's figure out, how they're related. The Red Stockings Manifesto said, women are oppressed. We identify men as our oppressors. That is not an invitation for a dialogue.
Agreed.
That is, you are our enemies. We do not want to hear anything you have to say. We don't care about your point of view. We don't care about what you need. We reject anything. They pretty much said this. Read it, the Red Stockings Manifesto. We reject anything that doesn't conform to our beliefs and experience. Now, that was 60 years ago. Today, we are in an era where we celebrate diversity. We do our best to listen to all points of view. We try to talk to our stakeholders. We try to find the win-win. We try to optimize decision-making by bringing as many points of view to the decision-making as we can. But in that environment, which is very healthy, we are stuck with the idea that men have nothing worth hearing. It's just an abomination.
It's sort of ironic, isn't it? I've seen a lot of the diversity committee stuff, and it's really interesting to hear in terms of where diversity needs to come from. And it's like diversity needs to come from everywhere except, men predominantly. It's like, well, how is that really diverse at that point? It's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's like pretty much the counter to what you're saying. It's ironic. So it's really interesting to hear it all played out.
And so what would have been better than the Red Stocking saying, we are oppressed and you are our oppressors? It would have been a whole lot better if women had said, hey guys, there's some stuff in our lives, it's really not so great. And we wonder how you guys are doing over there. Is there anything you'd like different in your life, in your lives? And I think that if that question had been posed in a way that was sincerely intended to get men to be honest and not to feel like they have to do what men often do, which is to say, oh, I'm fine. Couldn't be better. It's great. I got no problems. And if I did, I could take care of them myself because I'm a man and that's what men do. If the conversation was really intended to elicit from men what they would like and what they want and what they need, we could have done a deal. We could have done a swap. We could have done a negotiation. We could have had a win-win. There was no negotiation. It was a shakedown.
See, what you're saying makes so much sense.
You got it. Give it to us.
See, what you're saying is again, I think people are going to frame it the wrong way, is they assume that you automatically are against feministic characteristics, when all you're saying is we need to just be aware of the male experience, and we need to acknowledge the disadvantages and advantages that each gender group has, which, again, I think that that's a very valid message and a very true message. Just the name throws it off. It makes me automatically assume, or anybody reading your name, that you're just against feminism altogether.
Get over it. What do you think the word feminism sounded like 60 years ago?
Well, again, so
that sounded like, oh my God, that's so radical.
Well, just feminism? Like your point just a second ago, if they had framed it in a different light, if they had came at it with a different perspective or framed it in the form of open discussion, then it would have made the conversation a little bit easier to have. Just like, again, said, your name challenges that.
They could have said, so we're going to call ourselves feminists, and we're wondering if you guys might want to call yourselves masculists.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, see, that sounds funny, doesn't it?
It does.
That's how funny that's how funny the word feminist sounded 60 years ago. So, Dylan, at the top of the show, I talked about the fact that the most sexist idea of all is the belief that only one sex is ever sexist and only one sex is ever harmed by sexism.
Right.
That's the front of the T-shirt. On the back of the T-shirt, it says, feminism is 50% correct. If you don't understand that, you're 100% wrong. That's also intended to be slightly provocative, but also to make a point. I agree with feminism, much of feminism. My wife is a very successful scientist. I support her. I love her and honor her and cherish her and try to help her in any way I can. There's not much I can do, but I try. She's fabulous, and I love her for that. There's men who deserve to be loved too for doing things other than just making money.
Agree. Absolutely agree. And actually, Pink Duct Tape says, man is his own worst enemy.
Well, that's spoken like a man. It's men. No, one of the good things about male culture is that we take responsibility, and we don't try to shift responsibility. We try to take blame where it's due. Men will say, my bad, I screwed up. And if another man screws up, his buddies will often say, hey man, you really screwed up there. You shouldn't have done that. So yes, men are their own worst enemies. That's a noble sentiment. But it's very macho in a way. It's very macho in a way to say, yeah, nobody affects me in a way I don't want to be affected. I'm a rock. And even though I live in this society with laws right and left and telling me what to do, and even though I have to listen to what the judge says, I'm my own worst enemy. Yeah, it's nonsense.
See, you got some reservations about that one.
It's a good thing, but it can be taken too far. And I think we're at the point where we can see that a lot of bad things that happen to men and boys are not the fault of men and boys. We live in a very complex culture, and it's, the culture has influence on us and causes us problems.
Absolutely.
And if a man does things that exacerbate his problems, we would do well to inquire as to what influences in the culture induce him to pursue those behaviors. Often we will find that it's sort of a dysfunctional version of something good. That's just taken too far, or this fella can't manage it himself and needs help. But men are not rocks. We're not islands. We're not autonomous. We're not all Rambo.
Absolutely. And I think that that's being challenged today in 2021, which is a good thing.
Yes, no doubt.
Well, Mr. Jack, we are clean at an hour. That was quick.
That was fun.
That was fun.
That was fun.
Where can people find you?
You did a good job there, bud, by the way.
Well, I appreciate it.
Good questions. Good pointed questions.
Well, I appreciate you being articulate. I'm afraid some people might construe some of your messages, but I hope people listen to the whole podcast and they're not taken back by some of the things and actually keep an open mind. Again, you're not talking about being against women in any sort of way. I'm against some women in some ways, because there are some women who are not interested in being fair. There are some women who are interested in revenge against men. Now, I'm not saying we should hate them, but we should help them over their hatred. But I'm not, saying every brand of feminism is fine and wonderful and we need to embrace it. No, there's a lot of dysfunction out there on both sides of the equation. There are a lot of dysfunctional men, and they deserve to be talked about, but so do dysfunctional women. We got to get this thing, back on track. Absolutely. And where can people find your podcast?
Well, the hub of all of my activities is at my website, jackkammer.com. Sounds like Jack Hammer if you say it fast, but instead of an H in the last word, it's a K, Kammer, jackkammer.com. And there people can find my podcasts, my guest appearances on podcasts, my books, my articles, a little bit of stand-up comedy that I did. So jackkammer.com.
That'll be interesting to listen to.
Place to go.
I'm gonna have to play that the next time I'm in the car.
Listen to it. Very good.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight, Pink Duct Tape. This has been Daydreams. I hope everybody had a fantastic evening. Mr. Jack, I'm going to keep you over here for a few seconds. And thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Take care.